Vlahos. I'm an executive editor at the American Conservative magazine. I'm very proud to be here, and I'm very excited about this next panel. I came to Washington pretty much 20 years ago as a reporter, and it was very clear, and this was 1999, it was very clear there was a distinct delineation amongst the political think tanks in town. And as a reporter, you figure out right away who they are and where they're coming from. And I'm talking about places like Brookings, Heritage Foundation, and Cato, and they each have, and others, AEI, for example, they each have their political persuasion or their ideological, approach. And in 1999, things were mostly about domestic politics. And so it's very clear when you're talking about the liberal approach, you go to Brookings. If you wanted to talk about the conservative approach to issues, you go to Heritage and so forth. Then 9/11 happened, and things got really jangled up. And I remember as a reporter at the time expecting to go to these sources, whether at Brookings or Heritage, and find, maybe that they were talking about the war from their distinct, perspective. But that didn't happen. All of a sudden, all of the major think tanks in this town were talking about how we were going to pursue the war, whether it be in Afghanistan and then shortly after Iraq. There seemed to be no question about where we were going. Maybe there was some variation in how we were doing it, but this entire town was mobilized for war. And if you look behind you, it's like a map of the Beltway Blob out there, and you see the Capitol Dome. We're sitting in the seat of power of Congress. You have the Pentagon just over the river in Arlington, and then dotting the landscape are the defense contractors and consultancies. You have your major ones like Raytheon and Northrop Grumman and Boeing, and then you have your contracting groups that are maybe less known but as much lucrative and powerful as the others, like SAIC. You have General Dynamics, you have Booz Allen, and these people are employing thousands and thousands of Beltway residents in mobilizing the blob, the foreign policy establishment, the military-industrial complex. And one of the features of this blob are the think tanks. Think Tank Town is the name of this panel. And what I found was, as a reporter, that these think tanks were not only influencing the people in this building and the people in the White House, but they were also representing the Pentagon over there, and they were manipulating the media, the elite media, and us, the voter, the American people. And so I wanted to convene these folks here today to talk a little bit about how this all happened, how it works, how these think tanks sustain themselves, how they manage to manipulate the message, the intricate web between the contractors, the academia, the government, the military, all working together. How do the think tanks fit in? And I think for our benefit, how do we approach the information we are getting from that? Can we trust the information? Can we trust when these think tanks send experts to Capitol Hill to talk and testify on very important issues like war? Where are they coming from? Who's paying them? So without further ado, I'd like to introduce my panel here. Right to my immediate left is Carrie Levine. She's a senior reporter at the Center for Public Integrity, investigating the influence of money in politics. She previously served as research director at Citizens for Responsibility and Ethics in Washington, and as a reporter and associate editor for the National Law Journal, focusing on the lobbying industry. So she's a reporter that knows where the money is going and how it's being used. Same for Ben Freeman here. He is the director of the Foreign Influence Transparency Initiative at the Center for International Policy. Previously, he served as deputy director of the National Security Program at Third Way, and as the National Security Fellow at the Project on Government Oversight. He's the author of the Foreign Policy Auction, and he is the go-to guy for talking about foreign influence in think tanks and in Washington in general. So we're going to learn a lot from these two here. And then Chris Preble, who I've known for years, and I mentioned Cato, and just to clarify, Cato was probably the lone candle in the dark during those 9/11 years when all of the other think tanks were sort of like absorbing into the echo chamber, the groupthink of the post 9/11 world. Cato was actually talking out against intervention. It was talking out against the Patriot Act and talking out against the national security state. So Christopher today is the Vice President for Defense and Foreign Policy Studies at the Cato Institute. He is the co-author of Fuel to the Fire, How Trump Made America's Broken Foreign Policy Even Worse and How We Can Recover, and Peace, War, and Liberty, Understanding U.S. Foreign Policy. He has also taught at the University of California, St. Cloud State University, and Temple University. And last but not least is Stephen Wertheim, who's just recently come to town, is going to realize all of the scary stuff that we've been talking about in real time. He is the co-founder of the new Quincy Institute for Responsible Statecraft and research director of its Ending Endless War program. He is also a research scholar at the Saltzman Institute of War and Peace Studies at Columbia University and a visiting fellow at the Center for the Study of Statesmanship at Catholic University. So thank you for joining us. So I wanted to start with Carrie. One of the biggest issues in this town is the revolving door. So we often hear about military officials moving, from the military, retiring, and then going into these think tank sinecures where they earn a lot of money to go out and represent, military policy from a personal or a certain perspective. We also see defense contractors and government officials doing the same thing. At the same time, we see these think tankers leave and then go into government offices, into defense contracting. And so can you give us a sense of how all this is working together, this interlocking web, how it creates a sort of swampy ecosystem where everyone is invested in maintaining and promoting the status quo?
Well, hi, everyone. Thanks for coming out to this, first of all. It's a really fascinating question that I think goes to some of the heart of how people move around in Washington into different parts of the system. And so I think it's something that gets a lot of attention. It gets a lot of ink. I've written about it over the years. And obviously it's a known thing, right? Like, it's clear that this happens. It's often very public when it happens. So I think a lot of the question is, what does it mean? And how is, speaking as a reporter, how is a member of the public supposed to evaluate what it means? How is a member of the public supposed to gauge whether the fact that someone went from a defense company to a think tank to a government job is meaningful information, and how should they weigh it? And I think that's where it gets hard. But, here's an interesting example that I think came up last year and was really written about extensively. There was some good reporting about it. But Congress mandated the creation of a panel called the National Defense Strategy Commission and charged it to make some recommendations about U.S. national defense strategy. And so the people who were put on the panel were people who had, a long history of studying these issues. They were from think tanks. They were former government officials. And they released a report that concluded that the security and the well-being of the United States were at greater risk, and that there needed to be more defense spending, more strategic investments of certain kinds. And so as watchdog groups and reporters found, the members of that commission were really sort of good examples of this revolving door. One co-chair was a former ambassador who had worked for the Defense Department, who also at that time was working for a think tank that got funding from defense companies. Now, is that meaningful? Does that mean that what that person concluded wasn't valuable? I think that's where maybe reporters and everyone, where we need to do a better job, but it's hard. this is sort of a manifestation of a larger revolving door system where you have people with a lot of expertise leaving government, going into the private sector, to defense companies or to think tanks or to other areas with that expertise. Because there are, in some ways, market forces pushing them in that direction, right? There's better paychecks, there's less stress, there's reasons why people do it, and maybe they want, for all the right reasons, to continue being of service to the public on advisory boards in different ways. Theoretically, that's good, right? Except that how do you know whose interest they're representing? And I think it sort of gets sometimes at that age-old question of how do you know what's in someone's heart, right? You can't know how their experience is biasing them in ways that maybe even they themselves don't realize in the most generous reading of that. And so it becomes an issue where you try and put some sunshine on it, you try and have disclosure, you try as a reporter to write about things and say, hey, here's some stuff you should know around this. But it becomes very hard to gauge when it goes from being a fact to when it goes to being a problematic fact. And I think that's a lot of what the discussion today seems to be about.
And I think this goes back to the question of what is a think tank, and we don't have enough time to get into those kind of mechanics. But I think that people outside the Beltway tend to think that a think tank is just that. It's a place where ideas are it's like a breeding ground, an ivory tower, but also a laboratory for ideas. And they tend to think that those ideas are independent from the industry or the bureaucracy that they are researching and writing about and analyzing it. And I went on the website for the Center for New American Security, which was built as a democratic-leaning think tank, foreign policy, national security, as a sort of shadow government for Hillary Clinton when she was running for president the first time. And so you had a number of ex-government officials, academics, people still in the government who formed this website, think tank, so that they could, be her national security team in waiting. And that didn't work out. She didn't get the nomination, but they're still in existence today. I went on the website, and I started clicking through the experts. And I realized that several of them are still working. They're working as fellows, as senior fellows, but also working for the Pentagon, also working for a defense contractor or consultancy. And I was wondering, do you, and anybody else can jump in, do you feel like that's a little incestuous? I mean, on one hand, you could say they have the experience, so why not? But if we're thinking about think tanks as independent laboratories of thought, I mean, how do we separate their interests, their special interests or conflicts from the finished product?
It's tricky, right? It's, and I think it's an interesting question because, in part, you all are, I think, just gauging from the questions I've heard so far today, a relatively sophisticated audience that pays a lot of attention to these very thoughtful questions. And so I think part of the question has to be, instead of should we expect these places to be independent, does the public expect that? Does the general public, who after all can't, necessarily with their lives and their jobs and the other things competing for their attention, spend all their time kind of thinking about this particular issue? Do they expect that? And what's the gap between their expectations and reality? Because sometimes even when no one is doing anything wrong, it doesn't look right to people or it doesn't feel right to people. And it's not what they expect. And so I think the question really is, people seem to keep getting surprised by these ties. DC is perennially getting referred to as a swamp for what people will always point out, very righteously, is a situation that complies with all applicable ethics rules and regulations, right? And so, which is something that people say to me a lot when I call them. And so I think you really are looking sometimes at the daylight between what people think of as right and what people think of as legal. And that can be a very tricky terrain to get into. But I think it's worth giving some thought to not just whether people are doing what they have to do, but whether people are doing what the general public expects of them in a way that I think maintains people's comfort level. And those are really different gauges, and everyone has to kind of decide. But one thing as a reporter who writes for the general public that I find is that people who really know a subject well are much more comfortable with gray areas than people who don't.
I'd like to just move to Chris for a second, just as long as we're talking about the sort of influence operations that these think tanks do. You were obviously around during the immediate post 9/11 time and had seen how think tanks were involving themselves in policy and promoting war policy, sustaining the status quo. And, I go back to CNAS, it's one of my favorite subjects because I saw it grow from the bottom up. And I remember attending one of their first major conferences, and Professor Basevich was there, and it was funny because the entire room was filled with military, and some of them in their uniforms, greeting people when they got there. And if they weren't in uniform, they were in dark suits, and they were representing some, contracting organization or actual company, and they were excited about counterinsurgency, because they figured the war that had been a mistake to begin with had turned a corner thanks to David Petraeus and the surge, and so the entire town was promoting counterinsurgency, and if you weren't on the bandwagon, get out. And Professor Basevich was not on the bandwagon, and he put up a good fight, and it was one of the best think tank experiences ever. But how did you see this whole mobilization from a Cato perspective in terms of how these think tanks could work to manage the message and the bubble?
Thanks, Kelley. That wasn't quite the question I was expecting. I was here too, and I remember those days, and I think my early experience with CNAS was an attempt to sort of create a strategic dialogue or sort of competitive strategic dialogue, and it was pretty obvious in the course of that that they all sort of knew where they were going to end up, right? And so they went through and they solicited input from some fairly well-known scholars, including some people from outside of the city. But again, they knew what they wanted to arrive at, and so you can. It's not so hard to put your finger on the scale to make sure that. And again, Andy Basevich is a unique sort of person, so he gets into the room and he can really upset the apple cart. I like that. But the point I wanted to make was, I've been at Cato for 16 and a half years. I'm a libertarian, not a conservative, so thanks for letting me on the panel. And I think it's important for anyone over the age of, 40, to think about the next generation and where they're going to land in this ecosystem here in DC. Like, what kind of jobs are they going to do? What organizations are they going to wind up at? Because I've mentored a lot of people over the years, and I think you have to really look yourself in the mirror hard. And if someone comes to you and says, "I really want to advocate for realism and restraint, and I really want to argue against militarism and primacy. That's what I want to do," and you want to say, "Go get them, kid." And where are they going to do it, right? What place? I'm extraordinarily fortunate. Cato's a terrific place. We're a small place, right? There's only so many people we can hire, and we're twice as big as when I joined the Defense and Foreign Policy team. So I'm surrounded now by new outfits. Stephen and I are now in an active competition constantly, and this is good. And I just came back from speaking to students at Ole Miss and University of Alabama that was organized by the John Quincy Adams Society. which is a student organization that sort of talks about realism and restraint. But I think we really need to think about the revolving door. We need to think about the ecosystem of places. It must be much more than just Quincy and Cato and TAC, because I guess the way I think about it, my son plays football. My daughter is a theater, kid. She likes theater, and you'd always want to tell your kids, like, well, you need to be realistic. But then, at least there are 32 NFL teams, right? At least there's more than just 2 theaters in the world. I mean, and so I say this somewhat joking, but I hope you get my point, right? Is that can we currently, in good conscience, advise juniors and seniors in college to go for it, to reach for that brass ring, because if you believe in it enough, someone's going to hire you? My answer is not yet. We're getting there, but not yet. Do I have time for one other quick point? Sure. Okay. So then we've talked about the revolving door, and the revolving door actually has 2 connotations, and one is sort of seedy and swampy but the other part of the revolving door is it's about professional development, and it's about learning. It's about testing theories that you do in the ivory tower and then see if they actually work in government, and then you come back out and you retest your theory, so to speak. And we just haven't had a lot of that recently. And it didn't start in 2016, although I'll come to that. I remember a time in 2008 when Barack Obama had run against the wars, had defeated Democratic candidates who had voted for the Iraq War. I don't think there's any question that his opposition to the Iraq War in 2007 and 2008 helped him to secure the nomination. And what is the first thing that he did? Choose Hillary Clinton to be a Secretary of State. How incredibly demoralizing it must have been for the people who had worked on his campaign from the beginning, toiling through the snow in Iowa, who actually cared about foreign policy, to see those jobs go somewhere else. How incredibly demoralizing it is today when people who care about realism and restraint see Mike Flynn, H.R. McMaster, and John Bolton as the National Security Advisor. This is a problem. And so it's not just about the think tanks. It's about a government that is open to a set of ideas that by now should not be seen as outside the pale, because the other ideas have been tested and found wanting. So now is the time for that revolving door to actually function the way it's supposed to function, not in a seedy and unhappy way.
Well, I also, you kind of get to the point of the feeder organizations in DC right now, and 2 come to mind: the CNAS on the Democratic side, and the Center for American Progress as well, and then Heritage on the right side. And I know Monica Duffy Toft had talked a little bit in the second panel about academia and the programs there that are bringing kids to national security for the first time and fostering either diplomacy or a more active interventionist national security track. And what I found in my own research as a reporter is that a lot of the money that is going into these grand strategy programs, for example, in your top schools are coming from neoconservative sources or the more globalist, internationalist, liberal, status quo sources. And they're not coming from realists. I know that the Koch Foundation has been doing yeoman's work and trying to balance that out. But when these kids graduate and they come to Washington with dreams of working in international relations and national security, they're already formed, in a way. They're conditioned to believe that everything is a promotion of the status quo for a liberal interventionism overseas, a global hegemony, what Professor Basevich had called, I believe it was like the militarist globalization project. So when they get here, they're on one hand, they don't have anywhere to go if the think tanks don't exist to be a feeder. So they end up in places, and then those places are delivering up potential officials for when these there's a change in power in the White House. Stephen, this I think is a good segue to you because you're at Columbia University. Now you're here. You're building a new think tank that's going to tackle some of these issues on realism and restraint and be in opposition. How do you see it, A, as in academia? I mean, do I have it right, my conception of things? And B, are you finding that there are some of these challenges when you come to Washington and try to build the think tank for the first time?
Sure. Well, yes, I've spent basically the past decade plus in academia. I think my view of the state of play there is, to my surprise, maybe a little more optimistic than what you've just described. It's true, of course, that we're fighting an uphill battle in any realm, and academia is included in that. But actually, I think the larger problem is that there's a lot of people in academia without a whole lot of specific moneyed interests pushing them to, who have developed ideas of restraint for some period of time. There continues to be a need for much more work to promote that and to allow academics to take some time away from their overburdened core duties in order to come to DC and put their ideas in a state that can have some impact on policymaking and in the media. So that's vital work, but I think the larger problem, and one of the reasons why I decided to leave academia to co-found the Quincy Institute, is what do they do next if they want to make a difference in policy, if they want to put these ideas into action? Where does a student who has good ideas go? Because what I have seen and others have seen is that students may be in a restraint kind of mindset in their academic training, and then in order to have a career and make a living, which is a very important thing, somehow that goes away when they come to enter the policymaking fray in Washington. So that's one of the things that we are trying to change and solve that specific kind of problem at the level of think tank infrastructure in DC. And we're obviously standing on the shoulders of Cato and a whole host of other organizations who have been building up the framework for this work. I think it's one of the reasons why when the announcement of the Quincy Institute's formation broke, which I thought, who's going to care? Another think tank? A foreign policy? This is not a big story. Maybe a couple of my friends would notice, and that's about it. But people were really intrigued from many different walks of life. And one of the reasons I think is that for those who are paying attention, they understand that we're not just coming in with some half-baked set of ideas. These ideas have been worked out in academia, in institutions, think tanks, for some time, and so they could have some confidence that we mean it when we say that we want to practice responsible statecraft. And at the other time, we're at a unique moment in our politics, both internationally and domestically. We have a generational change in which a lot of the things that I'm saying that are derided by some in this town as isolationist or something, common sense to basically anybody a little bit older than me and younger than me. And they want to go further than I want to go much of the time. And that's true of veterans, war on terror veterans, and it's true of the war on terror generation. And we also, I think, have come to a unique point after the Cold War, where it's time to take stock, no matter who you are. We've seen Republican administrations several times, Democratic administrations several times, and we seem to be stuck in an endless war mentality, and it's pretty clear that the institutions in this town are broken, that there's public disenchantment with them, and they're not going to fix themselves. They're not going to take the kind of action that very belatedly you might have thought after Republicans and Democrats, grandees of the national security establishment, lined up in 2016 to say there's one candidate amongst the dozens that are running who is unfit for office and cannot be commander-in-chief. You just cannot vote for this person. And the public, the voting public said either we don't care, we'll vote for him for other reasons, or yes, that is a proof that this is our guy. I mean, if that's not a moment to take stock after all that's happened before, it's not going to happen otherwise.
I completely agree about the space that's been opened, because I think, you know, after being at the American Conservative since 2007, I've seen the landscape shift and change, and when President Trump, or when Donald Trump won the election, I think that allowed for this conversation that we're having to be had, but on a much greater scale. And I think that's because the voters spoke. And poll after poll shows that people want responsible foreign policy. They don't want all of the problems solved by military force. They don't want to be the policeman of the world. And so politicians have been forced to listen. Media has been forced to listen. Of course, there are barriers to that. And my next question to Ben is the influence of money. Because for as much as we can do networking and we can bring kids in and start putting them to work in realism and restraint and non-interventionist positions here, there is a ton of money coming into this town. And Ben has done a lot of work on the foreign money and recently been doing some research on foreign money coming into think tanks in this town. How has that influenced what the foreign policy conversation is right here at the seat of power and congressional power and in the White House that you can see and discern?
Yeah, thanks, Kelley. I think it's the influence of money is obviously immense, but I'm unfortunately going to take it back even a step further from DC and go back into the academic realm. And the reason I say that is because foreign governments have spent over $9 billion in the last 5 years on gifts to America's universities. What does that money buy? No, I'm actually asking. If you know, email me, please.
See us after the panel.
Yes, see us later. We don't know is the simple answer. We know the dollar amounts. We don't know what it actually buys on campuses. We have anecdotal stories of that influence. But we do know that a lot of that money is going to fund some of these major academic programs that send us their best and their brightest. Some of the finest master's programs in foreign policy in the nation are funded by foreign governments. They're funded by foreign powers, and a lot of those foreign powers have very vested interests in a more militarized, a more interventionist U.S. forein policy. You've probably heard about the Confucius Institutes on campus and their influence there. And I hate to give you more bad news. I'm all bad news, by the way. I'll warn you in advance. Confucius Institutes, while prolific in the U.S., China's not even the top spender when it comes to spending on America's universities. In fact, they're behind the Saudis and the Qataris. In fact, the Qataris spend almost 3 times as much as the Chinese do on America's universities. And so what is that influence by? You probably haven't heard about Saudi and Qatari influence on campus, but it matters. And obviously Saudi Arabia and Qatar both have a very vested interest in maintaining a more militarized and interventionist foreign policy in the Middle East. And so they're helping to fund folks at those schools. And only then do they come to DC, and only then do we get them here. And as my wonderful panelists have alluded to, the funding here is also decidedly driven by those same very interventionist forces. We have a forthcoming report on foreign funding of think tanks, and we only looked at the top 50 think tanks. We've identified over $100 million coming from authoritarian regimes going to think tanks here. That buys you a lot of jobs. A whole lot of jobs. I don't know what Cato's budget is, or Quincy's, but I assume it's smaller than that.
Which think tanks in town take no foreign money, Ben? Do you think of any? Are there 2, maybe 3?
And Chris makes a great point. It's actually hard to find folks who don't take foreign money. And one of the issues that we're stressing in our report is that one of the problems that we face when it comes to funding is that think tanks aren't required to disclose their donors. A lot of folks do. I will confess, I will be CIP, Foreign Funders Anonymous. We take money from the government of Norway. I confess it. We too are foreign funding addicts. But we publish it on our website. We put it in our reports. You know our funders, and so we put it out there. A lot of think tanks don't, and a lot of folks at these think tanks, they're the expert that you see on CNN or Fox News. They're the expert that you hear on NPR talking about the war in Yemen. And you have no idea that that expert is actually being funded by the Saudis, by the Emiratis, by folks that have a very vested interest in keeping the U.S. in those conflicts. So a lot of the work we're trying to do, we're trying to change that.
Can you maybe just talk a little bit about how that fits in into the greater echo chamber that Americans outside the Beltway who are just flipping on their television and they're trying to get some sense of how they should feel about a given policy, whether it be like, say, Syria or Saudi Arabia and they're in Yemen. I mean, how can you maybe track how that money comes in, what it might be used for, and what the results are on the other end, on the receiving end?
Yeah, I think that's a great question, Kelley, and it's hard. As Carrie alluded to, it's really hard to fully follow that money trail to where you can say, I like to joke that I'm a social scientist, so you know we never prove anything. I only have correlations, never causation, guys. And so I just point out, troublesome facts that this person is being funded by this foreign government and only says nice things about that foreign government. That just keeps happening over and over and over again. And the problem we have with your average consumer of media back home is that they have no idea that expert they're seeing on TV is coming from a place that might be heavily funded by the exact foreign government they're talking about. And I think even deeper than that happens right here. We're on the Hill, think tank experts who are coming from places that are heavily funded by foreign governments. They often testify before Congress, and the members of Congress they're testifying to have no idea that the person who's testifying on this country is actually being paid by that same country they're testifying about. Clear conflict of interest. Only the House requires disclosure of that, and it's a woefully under-enforced provision.
Oh.
Sorry, I told you bad news only.
Yeah, well, and I know everybody's thinking, well, what about the defense contracting money? Because like I described, we have an entire beltway filled with major mega defense industry representatives who have an army of lobbyists on the Hill, and they are funding think tanks too. Carrie, do you have any thoughts on, how that money is working its way through the system and why we should be wary of maybe some of these expert research, reports that we see, or when we see people defending a certain policy in the media and who they might be working for and where they're getting their money?
Right, and I think I'd also, just to build on what Ben has already said, and again, we're all bad news only up here. It's nice smiles, bad news. But I would also say that there's a real revolving door where former members of Congress and other government officials, but let's just shine a light on former members of Congress for a minute, go through the revolving door and will lobby for either defense contractors, or on occasion they will become foreign agents for countries that are attempting to buy, to make deals to buy things from those defense contractors. So I think that that's something also that comes into play, because former members of Congress, are often called upon for their expertise. They've been on armed services or on committees that really specialize in defense issues. They go out of Congress, they lobby for foreign nations, who want arms deals. They lobby for defense contractors, but they're still also getting calls to talk about subjects in which they are experts. So they're out there wearing a lot of hats, and the question is what hat they're wearing at the time that they're speaking to the public, right? And so I think sometimes that's really, really unclear, and it becomes difficult to tease out. And then you also have the problem where this former member of Congress say, and if you read foreign agent filings on a regular basis, you really see this, are lobbying their former colleagues on behalf of a country that wants an arms deal, and presumably on top of the defense, on behalf of the defense company that wants to sell those things to the foreign country. And so the whole thing gets really murky. And I think, that's one reason why the public has such a cynical view of how things get done in Washington and whose interests are represented here.
Chris, I hate to be all doom and gloom, and there is a question about whether or not we're going to take people who are working for think tanks, are they told, hey, we're getting money from country X or company X or industry X, you have to write about this, or you have to take this particular point of view, or is it much more subtle? I don't want to just assume people's motivations, what they're doing, the research that they're working on, the books they're writing. What kind of influence is it? Or are they getting the money because they already have that point of view? The chicken and the egg question.
Right. I think a couple points. I think it's more of the latter, Kelley, first of all. So there are individuals who have built a reputation for advocacy for certain positions which are attractive either to a defense contractor who happens to build that platform or that aircraft, et cetera, or are experts in a particular part of the world and therefore attract the attention of foreign governments. But the other point, and this has always been something at Cato which we've sort of strived to uphold, is to not question motives, right? It's hard sometimes, but I think you make a better argument when you do not simply infer that by virtue of the fact that funding flows a certain way, that it is somehow influencing the report. But as Carrie points out, sometimes that's hard. Sometimes it seems so obvious. My favorite recent example is when a long list of bad actors are there. Some report includes a long list of bad actors. Regimes that do not respect the will of the people, that do not afford rights to religious or ethnic minorities and things like that. Long list. And Saudi Arabia is not on the list, right? So it just sort of cries out, why might that be? And so I think, it's so tragic that the killing of one person, Jamal Khashoggi, one person, got so much more attention in this town than the killing of tens of thousands in Yemen and millions under threat of but look, so this is not an all bad news story because that did happen. That attention did come about, and some places that were okay with accepting that money, then they got a little more. And again, Ben's done some just absolutely terrific work on Saudi influence in D.C., and so I'm really mostly channeling the stuff the work that he's done.
And I'm a huge Cato fanboy, so it's a love fest here now.
Go ahead.
Could I just piggyback on that a little bit? And I think that this goes back to the comment I made about us pointing out correlations. And I think that a lot of people, a lot of times I talk to reporters, and not good reporters like Carrie, bad reporters.
Thank you.
Sometimes when I talk to folks, they're sort of looking for that smoking gun, that because there was this money, and then therefore that money bought this particular op-ed, or it bought a vote from a congressman. And that's just frankly not how the process really works. I very much look at this like and I'm going to put on my social scientist nerd hat again. It's a selection bias issue in that what's available to folks, people get selected into positions because of what they believe going in. I think by and large, as Chris said, that's true. You know, if you're an outspoken a proponent of Saudi Arabia, then you're more likely to work at a think tank that's funded by the Saudis or the Emiratis or whomever. What it creates, though, is the more opportunities there are available for those folks, then the more voices from those folks that you see out in the public, the more experts available to talk on mainstream media about all these issues. They only come from those folks who are contributing the money.
That's a great point. We only have a few minutes for Q&A, so if some folks want to form up and we'll do a lightning round, I'd like to just kind of conclude our questions with Stephen and bring it, back to a big picture. Some of the things I'm hearing here sort of translate into the idea that when you have these vested interests, whether it be the defense contracting industry or the foreign interests, and then academia funneling younger people into town who are looking to work from there, you kind of have this, we'll go right back to the theme of this conference, you have this sustainment of this orthodoxy, this consensus around the status quo, which is, interventionism, global hegemony, American exceptionalism. How does a group like the Quincy Institute is not going after the foreign money, that's not going after the defense interests, you need money, how do you compete in this environment to change the the conversation?
We take Visa, MasterCard, all of them, really. Just even Discover, I think we take. First of all, I don't think we should conclude from some of the bleak assessments provided in this panel that action is futile, that the situation is lost. I don't think it's true. If you look, it's not had a good run of it of late. But if you look back in American history, there have been quite vibrant peace movements, 19th, 20th centuries, that tended to bring together strange bedfellows politically in other respects around the cause of, let's say, anti-imperialism in 1898 or non-intervention in World War I, et cetera. And so I think there's a real opportunity. And we're seeing that in this moment. We were able to, I don't know that something like the Quincy Institute as an institute that is dedicated in its mission to moving U.S. foreign policy away from endless wars and toward the promotion of international peace through vigorous diplomacy. I'm not sure we could have even launched at any other point in my own lifetime. Mm-hmm. So it is possible. It does mean that since we're not getting anything from foreign governments or from, and I don't think we should just emphasize foreign governments alone, our own government with its vested interests, also deeply problematic, probably more problematic to the integrity of our foreign policy debate than foreign, but I'll leave that for the real experts in this question. We therefore, need to welcome as many people as possible across party lines, party, no party, whatever, to work together on this issue. And so far, one of the things that brought us some note was that Charles Koch's and George Soros's foundations are two of our initial donors. We have others. But that's the kind of cooperation we need to see more of, because we know we're in fact going to be pretty badly outgunned, if you excuse the metaphor, in this town. Even when you take us together on this stage, working together, there's still a lot of vested interests on the other side. And the other thing is that I think one of the good things about us is it's pretty much baked into our mission what we stand for. Even if we somehow wanted to take money from the Saudis, I don't think they're going to be asking because our mission is what it is. And one of our co-founders is Eli Clifton, has been working on the issue of foreign government money along with Ben for some time. So we are locked into having a mission-based organization, and it's a little bit of an experiment, and as the president says, we'll see what happens.
Can I just add one more positive thing to what Stephen said? I just don't want to end on a negative note. Is that the public is also on our side. If you look at the polling, and Cato and Trevor's still here, I see, have done just wonderful work on the polling. The public's with us. The public's not with the blob.
And I'll end on a negative note that, and I'm sure my good friend Gareth Porter out there will agree, that you had to go back 100 years to find a viable, strong a movement that could actually penetrate the consciousness. I feel like the Cold War period had created this architecture, which we call the military-industrial congressional complex, that is so powerful, and it has so many people invested in it at every level. When you think of the tens of thousands of people in this area alone that work for the government in foreign policy and national security, they don't want to cede that control. They don't want to cede that power. And as long as we are in these endless wars, they're protected. Their livelihoods are protected. Their legacies, and all of these bureaucracies are protected. So it is, I'm sure it's going to be an uphill battle either way. So I'll get to some questions. Why don't we do a lightning round where you ask your questions and then we'll parse them out. We have about maybe 5 minutes. Okay.
The biggest think tank in this country are the more than 200 million adult Americans who work and do their contemplations at the workplace, kitchen tables, coffee shops, and pubs. What is the Quincy Institute strategy? And by the way, the vast majority of them are either not registered to vote or are and have given up. What's your Institute strategy going to be to connect with them in real time?
I'll oversimplify this question for the sake of time, Ben, but does the Foreign Agent Registration Act not apply to people in think tanks as they cycle in and out of government? And if so, why does no one seem to care?
Good question.
Mr. Vlahos, I was wondering if the American Conservative or the Quincy Institute or Cato, doing your next conference that covers the military, might be located at Walter Reed and feature some of the experts who are disfigured veterans to talk about these issues and put them in a proper context. I mean, Dr. Basovich is the prettiest Vietnam veteran I've ever seen, but his plastic surgeon's probably a billionaire by now. And the Vietnam War ended when people started to see the effects of these bombs and guns.
I've heard a number of speakers talk about that younger people, there could be a generational phenomenon in terms of the demographic that would be open to a philosophy of restraint. And I wonder if there's any age-based strategies to connect with that younger demographic. And I can think of two off the top of my head. One is, I'm a little biased here towards the high-tech sector. The high-tech sector is skewed younger, and the high-tech sector has money, it has power, and it has a relatively libertarian philosophy, and sometimes even has a relatively anti-war philosophy. Microsoft Corporation came out with a digital Geneva Convention, which I understand kind of pissed off some people in the State Department, but it was sort of a peace-oriented thing. So that might be one area where you could connect with a younger demographic. Another one is, my experience is younger people might be open to restraint, but they like it to be left-wing philosophy of restraint. So is there a left-right coalition around restraint that might tap into a younger demographic as well?
Well, I just want to tackle the veterans question just for 2 seconds. I know that the American Conservative has been trying to incorporate veterans in our writing and in our conferences. We had Jeff Groom on an earlier panel. Last year we had an entire panel with veterans. We're finding that there are veterans coming home that are looking for this type of conversation and they want to participate, and we will endeavor to include them in every step that we make.
I'll take the last question. Ben already referenced my colleague Trevor Thrall's work on what we call generation restraint. We do think that the young people, millennials, and now, what's the last, Gen Z or whatever the heck, my kids, whatever they're called, that younger people are, for obvious reasons, they've seen the wars of the last 20 years. They haven't gone well. They're very skeptical of the use of force. They're skeptical of the military instrument generally, and much more open to other instruments of American power and influence. But that's where it gets tricky, because that means they are perhaps somewhat less nationalist in orientation. They're more open to trade and immigration. And so the question really is, how badly do we want this? Are we prepared to construct a cross-partisan, broadly ideological or not? And I think I've heard different opinions on that question over the course of the conference today. My position is we have to be bipartisan because the primacists are bipartisan. You have to fight them that way, and that would be my approach.
Yeah, can I just address a couple of the questions by directly building on what Chris just said? I think that, one of the useful things that the so-called restraint camp does is it names primacy. It gives a history of how primacy was constructed and of how it is maintained. And that denaturalizes primacy. It shows us this is a construction. It began at a certain point, although we can have arguments about when. It could also be undone and replaced. And it rests on assumption. Those assumptions are testable, or if not testable empirically, at least they're very debatable. And so I think that one of the things that we are doing is trying to build a transpartisan kind of coalition that doesn't replicate the kind of middling bipartisanship. And here I think, to return to an earlier question, it's not just kind of taking the model of the formation of the foreign policy elite from the interwar period in World War II and doing that but for restraint. I think what's needed is to make all the arguments that actually resonate with people where they are in their own lives, and given the politics they have, not the politics we might want them to see, and not just putting everything else to the side. So what we are trying to do is make, if you are on the left at the Quincy Institute, which perhaps I am, even though I'm here, make those arguments in authentic terms that speak to what I believe and why I believe it, and will land with people who are on the left. And same thing for on the right, and same thing if you're a libertarian, same thing if you're a centrist, but you're questioning what we've done before. And when you think about it that way, now it might sound like, oh, there's this amorphous coalition, they have all these differences, how could they ever work together? But that is, in fact, what primacy does. They have the same fractures in their coalition, if not more, in a sense. I think when you add issues like climate into the mix, some real choices are going to have to be made on the primacy side. So I think we should always think about, when we think about this question, and what are the prospects for diplomatic engagement and military restraint, let's keep in mind that while our adversaries might look really well established right now, in fact, they have the same challenges, and they're less aware of those challenges because they've grown complacent, and they don't feel as threatened as, in fact, I think they should.
Yeah, to the FARA question, it's a great question. FARA is a fascinating statute. If the next 2 weeks of your life are free, we'll go over it. But to this specific issue of think tanks, so this is actually kind of a hot issue in FARA, if that's such a thing.
There's so many now.
So many hot issues. But basically, there's an exemption in FARA that's for, and I'll quote from the statute here, bona fide scholastic activities. And at least in theory, this is why academics who may be getting money from foreign governments and folks at think tanks who are doing, legitimate research work, if they are taking money from foreign governments or are doing stuff at their direction, as long as it's for purely bona fide scholastic activities, then they are exempt from the statute. The problem is
really defined in the law.
Yeah.
So, sorry, I didn't mean to.
No,
but I
no,
mean,
no, you're right.
I think a lot of the problem with the Foreign Agents Registration Act is that this is a statute that was first written, it's kind of a World War II era statute. It's riddled with exemptions, and Congress, to some degree, has built a camel, right? Like, there's been things done to it over the years. It's maybe not what we started out with. We've kind of jerry-rigged it a little bit. And now it's a hot topic of conversation because it's the tool that we have for this moment. But I don't know that if people were, what I keep hearing from lawmakers is that, it's really not ideally crafted for this moment, right? It's operating in a world that the people who wrote the law maybe weren't living in. And so I think that one thing you have is FARA is so broad, and the exemptions over the years have been so vaguely defined, and there's so little case law and precedent that half the time, you could have the very small number of FARA experts come together to discuss something, and they're not going to agree on whether something is covered in the law. And so I think that that's something that is really fueling the debate over think tanks now, because what is bona fide scholastic activity? And so I think there's examples at the extremes where everyone can agree, right? But there's a whole lot of amorphous stuff in the middle where people aren't comfortable. And right now we're in a period of more active FARA enforcement. The Department of Justice is really paying a lot of new attention to this very dusty statute. And so you're seeing people register, you're seeing people seek advisory opinions from the department, you're seeing them get advice from the department based on more aggressive interpretations than you've seen in the past. So for instance, I just saw a firm file a bunch of retroactive disclosures under FARA, and when I talked to them about it, they had indeed gotten an advisory opinion from the Department of Justice saying they had to file. They were doing some work, and it had to do with deforestation and other sort of environmental advocacy, and some of that work was for international think tanks and nonprofits that are funded by the government of Norway, as it so happens.
This exact same issue happened for us at CIP. And so we requested an advisory opinion for exactly this deforestation work for an environmental program that we have. And they said, we believe you should register. And so now CIP is registered under FARA out of an abundance of caution. And I think that's where we're headed with a lot of think tanks who are taking foreign money. I think we're going to see more and more think tanks registered under FARA.
And it's out of an abundance of caution, but it's also because the Department of Justice told you to do it.
Yeah.
And so, not to put too fine a point on it, but I think there was a period when maybe their interpretation was less aggressive.
We do what we're told.
Okay, and with that, I do have to close up because we have a great panel next up, and we're again behind the time. But thank you so much. A round of applause for the speakers and for the audience.
Applause for all you guys. Thank you.